You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast for Teka Teka News.
One of the outcomes of that is that the APEC summit itself was somewhat overshadowed by the meeting of these two leaders.
US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping took center stage at this year's Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation or APEC Leaders Summit. A meeting between the two superpower leaders was long overdue amid rising tensions, including in the hotly contested South China Sea.
I think, however, all of the APEC constituent members would be happy to see an overshadowing if it meant that the US and China have a chance of stabilizing the relationship, such as the both economic importance of China and the United States to the economies of all APEC members, but also the deep concern that ripple through Asia about a possible conflict between the United States and China, or even just a prolonged rivalry between the two and the amount of uncertainty that creates.
In this episode, we listen in as analysts situate the current state of US China ties and its outsized effect on our region.
But the positives, I think, are, first of all, that they met. This was obviously a fairly low bar.
That's political scientist Jude Blanchette speaking at a roundtable hosted by the Center for Strategic International Studies, or CSIS. He was one of 3 China analysts at CSIS, a decades-old think tank based in Washington, to sit on the discussion panel.
But nonetheless, it's one that even a few months ago, there was a large number of questions about sort of would he or would he not, being Xi Jinping, visit San Francisco and join the meeting. There were questions about whether or not the continued sanctioning of Hong Kong's chief executive, John Lee Jiachao, was going to be sufficient to disincentivize Xi Jinping from attending.
Washington sanctioned Hong Kong's top official in 2020 for implementing what it called a draconian national security law.
Of course, the Chinese waited until the last moment to formally announce that Xi Jinping would be attending APEC, in part because Beijing was concerned that there might be some sort of competitive action coming out of the United States in between the time that Xi announced he was attending and the summit that would embarrass or put Chinese in a difficult domestic position. So I think such is the state of the relationship that mere attendance and the meeting itself was a positive sign.
So what exactly came out of the talk? Here's another China analyst at CSIS, Bonnie Lin.
It's interesting, again, that for both sides, there was a need to provide a broad list of guarantees, commitments, however you want to characterize it. On the U.S. side, President Biden made the same guarantees or commitments to the Chinese side that he made during Bali, which was very, very high at the strategic level, that we don't seek a Cold War, we don't want to change China's political system, we don't support Taiwan independence, we're not trying to use our alliances to contain China, and of course, we don't seek conflict with China. On the Chinese side, Xi Jinping also made some of those guarantees or commitments, saying that China doesn't seek path of colonization and plundering, China doesn't want to export its ideology, and doesn't plan to suppress or unseat the United States. I think the fact that these guarantees or these commitments have to be made at the meeting showcases actually how much each side doesn't trust that the other side actually abide by these commitments. And it showcases the areas that both sides still need to work on if we were to actually have a relationship that's more of a partnership.
Perhaps the most relevant outcome of this talk for our corner of the world is the partial resumption of military-to-military communication between the two rival powers. The pandemic, and tensions caused by the pandemic, played a role in the deterioration of an agreement between the two countries to ensure safety in the air and in the sea. But direct military contact between Washington and Beijing halted altogether in 2022, after then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's controversial visit to Taiwan.
The simple resumption of the military-to-military dialogues, which is a return to where we were just prior to Speaker Pelosi's visit last August, don't in and of themselves lead to a sort of magic outcomes where the United States and China are going to be able to manage tensions we had a deteriorating relationship between the US and China, even with the two military dialogues in place as of July of 2022.
That's CSIS analyst Jude Blanchette again.
So the return to these don't necessarily do anything in of themselves. And of course, I think the Chinese view these dialogues with a great amount of suspicion, seeing these as essentially mechanisms for the United States to entrap or freeze in place Chinese actions and gain a competitive advantage. So I think that the Chinese bring a high degree of skepticism about these. And of course, a lot of the areas where the military to military dialogue would need to take place are in areas or geographies that China states are its own territory or its own core interest and believes that the United States has no business being there.
One of those areas is, of course, the West Philippine Sea, which China continues to claim despite an arbitral ruling that says otherwise.
In the positives is one of the unstated but very clear reasons that the United States wanted a successful meeting with the Chinese is less that they thought this was going to fundamentally and permanently stabilize the relationship, or even that they were hoping to get a very robust set of outcomes or deliverables. But because the administration, as a part of its strategy to strengthen and build coalitions that can successfully compete against China's malign behavior, even those partners in the Indo-Pacific that are extremely worried about China, such as Japan, Australia, the Philippines, nonetheless want to see a stabilized relationship.
What he's arguing in short is that this meeting for the US was less about communicating with China and more about sending a message to China's anxious neighbors. That includes Manila.
And in fact, anything the United States can do to show that it is trying to manage the relationship with China helps America's ability to strengthen its security coalitions in the Indo-Pacific. So what looks to some critics like U.S. appeasement by meeting with the Chinese is actually, I think, a White House strategy that is designed more about strengthening competitive coalitions in the Indo-Pacific. And the meeting is the price you pay to be able to then turn around and do more with our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific.
Still, for these analysts, the dialogue left much to be desired.
And this is the banal point that everyone will make, but it's worth bearing in mind. A lot of the fault lines in the relationship were left untouched, necessarily so, and all of those are still before us. So the big key issues that are driving conflict or rivalry in the relationship around, say, technology or issues about management of tensions in the Taiwan Strait, those are all before us. Those were not fundamentally addressed in any way that led to substantive outcomes. And so while the achievements that were from the summit are good, and we should think of those as early building steps, the hard stuff still lies before us.
So where does that leave U.S.-China ties?
Since 2017 or 2018, I have been a consistent gloom and doom analyst on U.S.-China relations.
That's Scott Kennedy, the final China analyst on the CSIS panel.
I was very worried that the U.S. was going to launch a trade war and said it would have significant consequences for the relationship. It did. And then we saw the relationship continue to descend and really get worse during the pandemic. And things haven't looked very bright, particularly as we got to the spring and the balloon incident. And it looked like just something like that would totally derail the relationship or blow it off course. But now, I think after several months of diplomacy, I'm ready to change my tune a little bit. And I believe that we've achieved at least a fragile stabilization of the relationship. And I might go further to see it as unfragile. And what I'm talking about isn't a thaw in the relationship, isn't an improvement in the relationship, isn't a return to previous eras. It is a solidification of this competition, but making much less likely the tail risks, the negative tail risks of all-out decoupling and war. And I think that is an important achievement in and of itself, even though the relationship hasn't improved a lot.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uwe. Thanks for listening.